Close your eyes for a moment and let the world grow still. Somewhere beneath the golden sands of Egypt, beneath centuries of silence and forgotten stone, a woman once stood at the edge of the impossible and walked forward anyway. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for the world to make room for her. She simply reached out her hand, lifted the double crown of the most powerful civilization on earth, and placed it upon her own head. Her name was Hatshepsut, and the world was never quite the same after her. There is something almost dreamlike about her story. A queen who became a king, a woman who wore a false beard not out of deception, but out of sheer, quiet defiance. A ruler whose name was carved from stone after her death, as if erasing her could somehow undo what she had built. But history, like water, finds its way around every wall, and tonight we let her story flow. Settle in now. Let your breathing slow. Let the outside world drift just a little further away. Tonight we are traveling somewhere ancient and golden and full of wonder. We are walking the corridors of a civilization that lasted 3,000 years, and we are following the footsteps of the woman who may have been its greatest ruler. This is the story of Hatshepsut, the woman who crowned herself Pharaoh, and it is a story worth every quiet moment of the night. Before we begin this journey together, a gentle word. If these stories carry you softly towards sleep, if the sound of history told this way feels like a companion in the quiet hours, then let this channel stay close. A subscription costs nothing but a moment, and it means these stories will always find their way back to you, night after night, whenever you need them. Now, let us begin. There is a particular quality to the light in ancient Thebes just before dawn. It arrives slowly, the way all gentle things do. First, a faint softening along the eastern horizon, a pale blush where the sky meets the desert. Then, gradually, the great stone temples begin to emerge from the darkness, their carved walls breathing back the warmth of 10,000 years of sunrise. The Nile, wide and patient and silver in that early hour, moves in its ancient way, unhurried, purposeful, certain of its direction in a way that living things so rarely are. It was into this world that Hatshepsut was born. The exact year is uncertain, the way so many things in ancient history are uncertain, buried under layers of sand and silence and the slow erosion of time. Scholars place her birth somewhere around 1507 BCE, give or take a handful of years that the desert has swallowed and kept. What we know with more confidence is the world she was born into, and that world was extraordinary. Egypt in the early 18th dynasty was a civilization at the height of its confidence. The Hyksos, foreign rulers who had held the northern delta for generations, had been driven out just decades before Hatshepsut's birth. The pharaohs of her family, the Thutmose line, had led that expulsion with a combination of military brilliance and fierce national pride. Egypt had reclaimed itself, and in the glow of that reclamation, the kingdom was expanding, rebuilding, reimagining what it could be. Her father was Thutmose I, and Thutmose I was, by any measure, a remarkable man. He had not been born to rule. He came to the throne through a line of succession that wound through circumstance and marriage rather than direct blood, a detail that would have mattered enormously to the people around him, and that he clearly spent his reign quietly overcoming. He was a military commander before he was a king, and that background gave him a quality that purely palace-born rulers sometimes lack. He understood the world beyond the throne room. He understood distance and difficulty, and the particular kind of respect that has to be earned rather than inherited. By the time his daughter was old enough to understand the shape of her world, Thutmose I had pushed Egypt's borders further than they had ever reached. To the south, his armies had crossed into Nubia with a decisiveness that left no room for ambiguity. To the north and east, his campaigns reached deep into the Levant, into the region the Egyptians called Regent, pressing all the way to the banks of the Euphrates. When he returned from that northern campaign, he brought with him something no Egyptian pharaoh had ever brought back before, an inscription set on the banks of a river that flowed, bewilderingly, in the wrong direction, southward instead of northward. The Egyptians called it the inverted water, and the strangeness of it seemed to confirm what many of them already believed, that their king was a figure of divine proportion, capable of encountering things that simply should not exist, and returning home anyway. Into this household of this man, Hatshepsut was born. Her mother was Amos, the great royal wife, a woman of pure royal lineage whose bloodline lent Thutmose I a legitimacy that his own background could not quite supply on its own. In the careful mathematics of ancient Egyptian dynastic politics, the mother's lineage mattered enormously, and so Hatshepsut, child of both a great military king and a great royal wife, arrived into the world carrying a weight of expectation and significance that must have been palpable even in her earliest years. She was not the only child. There were others, sons and daughters whose names appear in fragments across various inscriptions, their lives and deaths reconstructed from scattered clues. But the sons died young, as children so often did in a world without modern medicine, where the line between a healthy childhood and a sudden devastating fever could be crossed in a single afternoon. One by one, the male heirs that Thutmose I had counted on to carry his legacy forward disappeared into the quiet permanence of the royal necropolis. Hatshepsut remained. What that survival meant to her father we can only imagine. What it meant to her she left us clues about, not in diaries or letters, because those intimate documents rarely survive 3,500 years, but in something more durable and perhaps more honest, the monuments she built later in her life, the stories she commissioned to be carved into stone, the careful and deliberate mythology she constructed around herself. In those carvings, she returns again and again to her father. She quotes his praise of her. She depicts his blessing. She positions herself explicitly as his intended heir, the child he recognized, the one he pointed toward the throne with his own hand. Whether this was literally true is a question that historians still debate in quiet scholarly corners. But it tells us something about what she remembered, or wanted to remember, or needed the world to believe. It tells us that the relationship between Hatshepsut and her father was the first great shaping force of her life. And it tells us that long after he was gone, she was still reaching back toward him, still drawing warmth and legitimacy from the memory of a man who had looked at his daughter and seen, perhaps, something worth seeing. Thebes in those years was a city of extraordinary sensory richness. The temples smelled of kefi, that complex Egyptian incense made from honey and raisins and myrrh and a dozen other ingredients, burned morning and evening in rituals so old that no one alive remembered their origin. The markets along the Nile waterfront were full of sound and color, bolts of linen in every shade of white, jars of oil and grain, the bright flash of faience jewelry catching the afternoon light, the low conversation of merchants and priests, and ordinary people going about the remarkable business of living inside the greatest civilization on earth. A royal child would not have moved through those markets freely. Her world was more contained. The palace, the temple, the carefully managed ceremonies of royal life. But contained does not mean small. The royal court of Thutmose I was one of the most intellectually vibrant environments in the ancient world. Scribes moved through those corridors, carrying documents that mapped the known world. Architects debated the proportions of future monuments. Priests debated theology. Diplomats arrived from distant lands carrying gifts and greetings and the latest intelligence about the shifting world beyond Egypt's borders. And a sharp child raised in the center of all of that, a child who was watching, always watching, would have absorbed it all. Let the image settle for a moment. A girl in white linen, standing at the edge of a palace colonnade, watching the Nile move in the late afternoon gold. She does not know yet what she will become. She does not know the weight she will one day carry, the decisions she will make, the stone she will move, and the stone that will later be moved against her. She is simply a child in a world of extraordinary richness, watching, listening, learning the shape of power from the inside. But already, even now, something in her is paying very close attention.
There's a thing that happens to children who grow up inside greatness. It does not make them all great. In fact, it does the opposite to many of them. It miniaturizes them, makes them timid, makes them forever aware of how large the shadow is that they are standing in. To grow up as the child of a legend is to be measured constantly and without mercy against a standard that most human beings cannot reach. It is to hear your parents' name spoken with a reverence that your own name, at least for now, does not yet carry. It is to understand, in the wordless way that children understand things long before they can articulate them, that the world has expectations of you that you did not ask for and cannot easily refuse. But occasionally, rarely, and only in certain kinds of children, proximity to greatness does something different. It ignites. Hatshepsut was that kind of child. The education of a royal daughter in the Egyptian 18th dynasty was not the diminished, ornamental thing it would become in other cultures and other centuries. Egypt had a different relationship with female intelligence and female capability. Imperfect, certainly, and still bounded by structures that favored men in almost every official capacity, but genuinely more open than most of the ancient world. Women in Egypt could own property. They could bring legal cases to court. They could conduct business, manage estates, enter contracts. A royal woman moved through a world that acknowledged, at least in practice, that she had a functioning mind worth educating. And so, Hatshepsut learned. She learned to read and write the hieroglyphic script, not merely to recognize it as a ruler might, but to use it with the fluency and precision of someone trained in the scribal arts. This was no small thing. Hieroglyphs were a system of extraordinary complexity, at once phonetic and ideographic, capable of expressing both the precise measurement of a grain supply and the most elevated poetry of divine praise. To be truly literate in that system required years of patient study. It required sitting with papyrus and palette and reed pen, practicing the same signs hundreds of times until the hand knew them without the mind having to think. She learned mathematics and architecture in its conceptual forms, the proportions and relationships that governed how temples were designed, how obelisks were balanced, how a building could be made to speak a theological statement through nothing more than the angle of its light and the width of its corridors. She learned the religious texts, and this, perhaps more than anything, shaped the particular quality of her mind. Egyptian theology was not a simple thing. It was layered and recursive and deeply concerned with relationship. The relationship between the living and the dead, between the human and the divine, between Ma'at, the great principle of cosmic order and truth, and the ever-present possibility of chaos that threatened to unravel it. The pharaoh was not merely a political ruler in this worldview. The pharaoh was a theological necessity. The pharaoh was the living Horus, the earthly point of contact between the human and the divine one, the figure whose daily rituals and correct behavior literally held the cosmos together. To understand this was to understand that kingship in ancient Egypt was not about ambition, it was about responsibility of an almost incomprehensible scale. Whether Hatshepsut understood this as a child or came to it gradually, we cannot know. But the evidence of her later reign, the meticulous attention to religious ceremony, the extraordinary investment in temple building, the care with which she constructed her divine legitimacy, suggests that she understood it deeply and took it seriously, and felt it not as a burden, but as a calling. Her father saw it in her. This, at least, is what she wanted posterity to believe. And in the famous inscription she would later commission at Deir el-Bahri, she describes a scene that has stayed with historians for 2 centuries. Thutmose I, she writes, gathered his court around him. He spoke of his daughter in terms of explicit praise, of recognized intelligence and capability. He positioned her before his assembled officials and priests as his intended successor. He called her great, which in the Egyptian royal titulary was not a casual compliment, but a specific and weighty designation. Now, there is a scholarly debate here that is worth pausing for, even in the soft hours of the night. Did this scene actually happen? Did Thutmose I genuinely and publicly name his daughter as his heir? Or was this a story Hatshepsut constructed retroactively, decades later, when she needed to justify a position she had taken by other means? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. The inscription exists, the scene is described, but inscriptions commissioned by pharaohs were not neutral historical documents. They were deliberately crafted narratives, carefully designed to make specific political and theological arguments. Every pharaoh told the story of their own rise in the most favorable light available. What we can say is this: Hatshepsut believed her father saw her, or she needed to believe it, or she needed everyone else to believe it. And perhaps all three of those things are true simultaneously in the complicated way that memory and need and political necessity are always braided together in the lives of powerful people. Because what is certain is that Thutmose I did not live to see what his daughter would become. He died, the precise year uncertain, sometime in the second decade of the 15th century BCE, and the world he left behind was one in which a young woman of extraordinary capability found herself navigating a transition that had not gone according to any plan she might have imagined for herself. The throne did not pass to Hatshepsut. It passed to a half-brother. His name was Thutmose II, and he was the son of Thutmose I by a secondary wife, a woman of lower status than Hatshepsut's mother, Ahmose, which meant that in the careful hierarchy of royal blood, Hatshepsut outranked him. But rank in ancient Egypt, as in most human societies, was a more complicated thing than bloodline alone. The precedent for a female pharaoh existed. There had been women who had held supreme power before, though rarely and briefly. The precedent for a male heir, even of slightly lesser maternal lineage, was far more established, far more expected, far more comfortable for the machinery of the state. And so Thutmose II became pharaoh, and Hatshepsut, daughter of the great Thutmose I, keeper of a mind that had been quietly sharpened in the corridors of power since childhood, became his wife. The marriage of half-siblings in the Egyptian royal family was not unusual. It was in fact standard, a way of consolidating the royal bloodline and ensuring that divinity remained concentrated within the family rather than being diluted through marriage to outsiders. Hatshepsut would have understood this. She would have accepted it as the architecture of the world she lived in, the way one accepts the shape of a building one did not design but must nonetheless inhabit. But inhabit it she would, with a precision and an intention that no one around her quite anticipated. The girl who had stood at the palace colonnade watching the Nile, the child who'd absorbed theology and architecture and the language of power with a quiet, unhurried thoroughness, was now a queen, and she was just beginning. The night grows softer now, as if the desert itself is settling down to listen, and somewhere in the warm dark of those ancient corridors, a young woman is watching and waiting and thinking thoughts that the world is not yet ready for. But the world, whether it is ready or not, is about to find out.
There is a particular kind of waiting that is not passive. It looks like stillness from the outside. It has the appearance of patience, of acceptance, of a person who has made their peace with the role they have been given and settled quietly into its edges. But on the inside, it is something else entirely. It is the waiting of a mind that is always working, reading the room, reading the people, reading the slow and shifting currents of power that move through any court like an underground river, invisible on the surface, but carving the landscape nonetheless. This was the kind of waiting Hatshepsut did as queen. The court of Thutmose II was not an unpleasant place to inhabit by the standards of the ancient world. The 18th dynasty was a period of genuine cultural flourishing. Art was becoming more naturalistic, more emotionally expressive, moving away from the rigid formality of earlier periods towards something that felt, occasionally, almost tender. The temples were being expanded and beautified. Trade routes were open and prosperous. The kingdom that Thutmose I had pushed to its greatest extent was being maintained, if not dramatically extended, under his successor. But Thutmose II was not his father.
The historical record regarding his reign is thin, not necessarily because he was a bad king, but because the monuments he left behind are fewer and smaller and less remarkable than those of the rulers on either side of him. Ancient sources describe him as physically fragile, a man whose body did not match the idealized muscularity of the pharaonic image carved above him on temple walls. Modern analysis of the mummy believed to be his suggests someone who suffered from significant illness, skin conditions, possible systemic disease, a body that was working hard simply to keep living. He ruled for somewhere between 3 and 13 years, depending on which Egyptologist's reconstruction of the chronology you follow. And then he died, quietly, as fragile things tend to do. But before that death, there was a life. And inside that life, there was a marriage. And inside that marriage, there was Hatshepsut, watching, managing, slowly and carefully making herself indispensable in ways that left no fingerprints. We know she bore him a daughter. Her name was Neferure, and she appears in the records as a child of obvious significance, educated, prominent, the subject of considerable attention and investment from her mother. Hatshepsut clearly adored her, or at least the monuments suggest a closeness and a pride that feels genuine even across 3,500 years of stone and silence. Neferure would later play her own small and poignant role in her mother's story, a role that carries with it a particular kind of sadness that we will arrive at in time. Thutmose II also had a son by a secondary wife, another woman of the court, lower in status than Hatshepsut, whose name was Iset. The son was named Thutmose III, and he was very young when his father died, very young, and yet suddenly the heir to the most powerful throne in the known world. This is the moment. This is the hinge on which everything turns. A child king needed a regent. This was simply the practical reality of ancient governance. A boy of 2 or 3 or 5 years could not hold court, could not conduct diplomacy, could not lead armies or manage the theological machinery of the state. Someone had to stand in the space beside the throne and do the work of ruling while the king grew into the capacity to do it himself. The choice of regent was therefore one of the most consequential decisions a dying king could make, and in the case of Thutmose II, the choice was, on its surface, obvious. Hatshepsut was the great royal wife. She was of the highest royal blood. She was intelligent, experienced, deeply embedded in the religious and administrative life of the court. She was the stepmother of the child king, and therefore the natural figure of maternal authority around him. She had spent years quietly accumulating the knowledge and the relationships that a regent would need. She was the only real choice, and she knew it. The regency began with all the appropriate ceremony and all the appropriate language. Hatshepsut lay regent, Thutmose III was king. The inscriptions and the monuments of the early period reflect this arrangement with the expected clarity, a small king figure and a female figure standing in proper relation to each other, the hierarchy nominally intact. But Egypt was watching a woman manage the affairs of an empire with a competence that was difficult to ignore. She conducted the rituals, she received the foreign dignitaries, she oversaw the administration of the grain supply, the management of the temple estates, the movement of trade goods up and down the Nile. She made decisions, and the decisions were good, and the kingdom was stable, and the crops grew, and the Nile flooded at the right time and retreated at the right time, and Maat, cosmic order, the great principle of rightness, seemed to breathe easily through the land. There was a man beside her for much of this. His name was Senenmut. The story of Senenmut is one of the most quietly fascinating subplots in all of ancient Egyptian history, and we will spend proper time with him in a later chapter because he deserves it. For now, it is enough to say that he appeared in the court of Hatshepsut as a man of non-royal birth who had climbed through the scribal and administrative ranks on the pure force of his intelligence. He became the tutor of Neferure. He became Hatshepsut's chief steward. He became, according to some readings of the evidence, the architect of her greatest buildings. And he became, according to the crude graffiti that rivals scratched on the walls of unfinished tombs, something more intimate than any of that. Whether the rumors were true, only the desert knows. What is clear is that Senenmut and Hatshepsut functioned together with a coordination and a mutual trust that was remarkable by any era standards. He was her instrument, and perhaps her confidant, the person who could take the vast architectural and administrative visions forming in her mind and translate them into the practical reality of stone and labor and logistics. In a world where a woman's power was always being watched for weakness, for overreach, for the moment when it could be questioned and removed, Senenmut was a kind of anchor, a brilliant, capable, deeply loyal presence who extended her reach without threatening her authority. The regency deepened, the months became years, and something was shifting, slowly, quietly, in the way that the most significant shifts always happen. The inscriptions began to change. The images began to change. Hatshepsut's figure in official representations began to grow in relative size, and in the visual language of Egyptian art, size was not an aesthetic choice, but a theological statement. The larger figure was the more important figure, always, without exception. Her titles began to expand. The language used to describe her began to borrow from the language used for kings rather than queens. And then, one day, or perhaps gradually, across a series of carefully managed ceremonial moments, each one building on the last, she took the final step. She did not merely manage Egypt, she became Egypt. The double crown, the crook and the flail, the false beard of kingship, that ancient symbol of divine authority, tied carefully beneath a face that was, unmistakably and permanently, the face of a woman. Pharaoh Hatshepsut. The title settled over her like something that had always been waiting, like a garment made specifically for this body and no other, like an answer to a question the universe had been holding quietly in reserve for 20 years. Outside, the Nile moved in its ancient, unhurried way. The temples caught the morning light. The desert held its long, golden silence. And somewhere in the palace at Thebes, a woman who had spent a lifetime watching and waiting and learning the precise shape of power sat in the seat that all of that watching and waiting had been moving towards. She had arrived. And now the real work would begin.
There is a kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with trumpets or proclamations. It does not carve its name into the side of a monument or demand that the crowd part to let it through. It moves differently, quietly, carefully, through the side doors of rooms where decisions are made, through the soft spaces between official words, through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small moments that no one writes down because no one thinks to. It is the power of presence, the power of being, consistently and unmistakably the most capable person in any room you enter, and having the patience to let the room figure that out on its own terms and in its own time. This was the power Hatshepsut wielded as queen. The years of her marriage to Thutmose II are not the years that history tends to linger over. They sit between the more dramatic chapters of her story, before the regency, before the transformation, before the monuments and the obelisks and the extraordinary journey to Punt. They are the in-between years, the years of becoming rather than being, and perhaps because they lack the clean narrative shape of what came before and after, they're easy to move past quickly. But they deserve more than that, because it was in those years, in the careful and constrained role of great royal wife in ancient Egypt, that Hatshepsut built the internal architecture of everything that followed. It was there, in the ceremonial chambers and the administrative corridors and the quiet hours of temple ritual, that she assembled herself, piece by piece, relationship by relationship, skill by skill, into the figure she would eventually become. And the first thing to understand about those years is that the role of great royal wife in ancient Egypt was not a small thing. It is tempting, from the distance of our own era, to read the title through the lens of what queenship would come to mean in other cultures in later centuries: the decorative consort, the political bargaining chip, the woman whose primary function was to produce heirs and look beautiful at ceremonies. But Egypt was not medieval Europe, and Hatshepsut was not a passive figure, even when the structures around her most constrained her movement. The great royal wife had genuine religious functions. She was the embodiment of specific divine principles, the female counterpart to the king's divine masculine, the earthly representative of goddesses like Hathor and Mut, whose roles in the cosmic order were not subordinate but complementary, essential, load-bearing. In the temple rituals that structured Egyptian daily life, the queen's participation was not ceremonial decoration, it was theologically necessary. Without her, certain rites could not be completed.
Without her, the divine balance that held the world together was, at least symbolically, incomplete. Hatshepsut took these religious functions with absolute seriousness. The temple records from the period of her queenship show a woman who was present, engaged, meticulous. She understood the liturgical texts, she knew the ritual sequences, she moved through the ceremonial spaces of the great temples at Karnak and Luxor with the fluency of someone who had been absorbing their logic since childhood, which of course she had. The priests noticed. In ancient Egypt, the priests were not merely spiritual functionaries. They were also administrators, scholars, and one of the most significant networks of institutional power in the kingdom. To be respected by the priesthood was to have access to a kind of influence that operated independently of the palace hierarchy. Hatshepsut cultivated that respect with care. She also cultivated the scribal class, those extraordinary men who formed the backbone of Egyptian administration, who kept the records and drafted the correspondence and managed the movement of goods and people across an empire that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the borders of the Levant. The scribes were not glamorous figures, but they were indispensable ones, and a queen who understood their world, who could speak their language, who read the documents they produced rather than simply having them summarized, who asked intelligent questions about the numbers in the grain accounts, was a queen who accumulated, quietly and steadily, a network of people who trusted her judgment. This is what Hatshepsut was building in those years. Not monuments, not yet, but something in some ways more durable. A web of relationships, a reputation for competence, a presence in the administrative and religious life of the kingdom that was so thoroughly woven in that removing it would have meant unraveling the fabric itself. Meanwhile, beside her, Thutmose II ruled. It is perhaps unfair to history to describe him primarily through the lens of his limitations. He was not, by the available evidence, a cruel man or a foolish one. He conducted military campaigns in Nubia with reasonable effectiveness. He maintained the administrative stability his father had established. He performed the rituals of kingship with the expected dedication. But he was not a transformative figure. And in the particular context of a marriage to Hatshepsut, a woman whose inner life was operating at a register that the surviving evidence suggests was simply several octaves above what surrounded her, he becomes almost inevitably a background figure. There is something quietly melancholy about that. He was a man living in the shadow of his own wife, in a culture that would not have permitted him to acknowledge it even if he had felt it, which perhaps he did not. Perhaps the particular shape of his awareness did not include a clear perception of the differential between his capabilities and hers. Or perhaps he did, and he found a way to make peace with it that left no trace in the historical record. We extend him the grace of uncertainty, as we should extend it to all figures whose inner lives the centuries have not preserved. What we do know is that the marriage produced at least one child who survived, the daughter Neferue, whose presence in the records is warm and consistent enough to suggest that she was genuinely beloved. Images of Neferue appear across the period of her reign with a frequency and a tenderness that speaks of something more than political calculation. She is shown as a child, as a young woman, in the company of her tutor, Senenmut, in religious contexts, in positions of some ceremonial importance. She was her mother's daughter in ways that went beyond bloodline, and she was, for a time, something else as well. She was, in the careful planning of a mother who was already thinking farther ahead than the present moment, a potential piece in the architecture of legitimacy that Hatshepsut was quietly constructing. If Neferue could be elevated to the role of great royal wife to the young Thutmose III, then Hatshepsut would become not only regent and pharaoh, but mother-in-law to the king, grandmother of future kings, a figure whose blood ran through the next generation of the dynasty in multiple directions simultaneously. Whether this plan was ever fully realized is one of the tender uncertainties of Hatshepsut's story. But the thinking behind it tells us something important. It tells us that even in those early years of queenship, even while she was performing the correct rituals and managing the correct relationships and inhabiting the role of great royal wife with impeccable precision, Hatshepsut was also doing something else. She was playing a longer game. She was thinking in decades rather than seasons. She was, with the particular quality of mind that had been forming since childhood in the palace of Thutmose I, holding multiple versions of the future simultaneously and working quietly toward the ones she preferred. the Nile moved outside the palace walls, indifferent and eternal. The incense rose in the temples, and the prayers were said, and the administrative documents moved through the scribal offices, and the kingdom breathed in and out in its vast ancient rhythm. And in the center of all of it, a woman who had not yet done the thing she would be remembered for was already, in every way that mattered, becoming it.
There are moments in history that do not look like moments. They do not arrive with the weight and ceremony that their significance deserves. They slip in quietly, dressed in the ordinary clothes of just another day, a death, a succession, a child placed on a throne too large for his small body, and only later, when the dust has settled and the story has found its shape, does it become clear that everything after was different from everything before. That a line was crossed, that the world, in some quiet and irrevocable way, had changed. The death of Thutmose II was one of those moments. It came, as fragile things come, without adequate warning. He had been unwell for some time. The deteriorating health that the mummy evidence suggests was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, grinding diminishment, the kind that robs a person of their vitality gradually, like a candle burning down rather than a flame blown out. The court would have been aware of it. The priests would have been praying. The scribes would have been, with the particular pragmatic efficiency of people who manage the mechanics of power, quietly preparing for the transition that everyone could see coming, but no one was permitted to name aloud. When it came, the machinery of succession moved with practiced speed. The young Thutmose III, the son of the secondary wife Iset, the child who carried the male bloodline that the dynasty required, was elevated to the position of pharaoh. He was, depending on the reconstruction you follow, somewhere between 2 and 10 years old. Old enough to stand in the ceremonial spaces and be dressed in the regalia. Young enough that everyone in that room knew with absolute clarity that the real governance of Egypt would have to come from somewhere else. It came from Hatshepsut. The formal title was Regent. The practical reality was something more total than that word suggests. A regent in the Egyptian system was not a caretaker in the limited sense, not someone who simply kept the throne warm and the administrative machinery running until the real ruler arrived. A regent spoke with the authority of the throne. A regent made decisions of consequence. A regent was, for the duration of their regency, the functioning center of the state. And Hatshepsut was not a woman who functioned at half capacity. The early years of the regency are a study in careful, intelligent restraint. The official record from this period shows Hatshepsut operating within the expected parameters, deferring to the nominal primacy of the young king in the formal language of inscriptions, maintaining the hierarchies that the court expected to see, performing the role of regent with the correctness and precision of someone who understood that the slightest misstep would be seized upon and used. She had enemies, as every powerful person does. There were those in the court who watched her management of the kingdom with eyes that were not entirely friendly, men whose own ambitions had been constrained by her competence, priests whose institutional interests did not perfectly align with hers, officials who had built their careers in the service of the male line and who felt, perhaps, a low and persistent unease about the direction things were moving. She gave them nothing to work with. This is the part of Hatshepsut's story that is easiest to underestimate, because it is the part that looks the least dramatic. But the discipline required to move through those early years of regency, to hold enormous power while appearing to hold only appropriate power, to build the foundations of something unprecedented while giving no visible indication of what was being built, was itself a remarkable achievement. It required a quality of self-possession that is genuinely rare. It required the ability to think 10 moves ahead while appearing to be entirely absorbed in the move directly in front of you. She was managing an empire. The details of daily governance in ancient Egypt were staggering in their complexity. The kingdom was divided into administrative regions called nomes, each governed by a nomarch who reported to the central administration. The agricultural system, the lifeblood of the civilization, the thing that the Nile's annual inundation made possible and that everything else depended on, required careful management of irrigation, of seed distribution, of labor allocation, of grain storage and taxation. The temple estates, which controlled significant portions of Egypt's productive land, needed to be managed in coordination with the palace rather than in opposition to it. The military required provisioning and direction. The borders required monitoring.
And beyond the borders, the wider world was watching. The kingdoms and city-states of the ancient Near East had a sophisticated understanding of Egyptian power, and they were quick to test the edges of it when circumstances seemed to invite that testing. A regency, particularly one centered on a woman, might have seemed to some of those external observers like an opportunity. Hatshepsut withstood this. The diplomatic correspondence from the period of her regency shows a ruler who was attentive and firm in her management of Egypt's external relations, who understood that the projection of confidence and capability was itself a foreign policy. She did not project uncertainty, not once. Inside the palace, her relationship with the young Thutmose III was something that historians have spent considerable energy trying to understand. The traditional narrative, shaped in part by the later erasure of Hatshepsut's monuments, which seemed to suggest a bitter rivalry, imagined a stepmother and stepson locked in a cold and hostile dynamic, the older woman suppressing the younger man's legitimate claims for her own advancement. But the evidence, examined carefully, does not entirely support that picture. Thutmose III was educated. He was trained in military arts, in administration, in the religious knowledge that a pharaoh required. He was not hidden away or minimized in ways that would permanently damage his capacity to rule. When he eventually did rule, after Hatshepsut was gone, he ruled with extraordinary effectiveness, becoming one of Egypt's greatest military pharaohs, a figure of such capability that later generations would call him the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. That capability had to be built somewhere. It had to be nurtured. And the most likely environment for that nurturing was the court of Hatshepsut, where competence was the operating standard and excellence was what the air tasted like. Maybe she taught him in the way that people teach through example rather than instruction. Maybe he watched her manage the empire and absorbed, whether he wanted to or not, something of her approach to power. Perhaps the relationship was more complicated than either rivalry or warmth. The strange, layered dynamic of two people who were simultaneously allies and competitors, bound together by the needs of the state and the accident of their shared situation. We hold all of these possibilities gently without forcing them into a cleaner shape than the evidence permits. What we know is that the regency continued. The months accumulated into years. The young king grew slowly and steadily toward the age at which the question of his independence would need to be answered. And as he grew, something else was happening, something that the court was watching, and the priests were watching, and the scribes were watching, and the foreign diplomats who passed through the palace were watching, even if none of them had yet found the precise language to describe what they were seeing. Hatshepsut was not diminishing as the king grew. She was expanding. The titles were shifting, the images were shifting. The theological language surrounding her was shifting, moving, degree by careful degree, away from the vocabulary of queenship and regency, and towards something that had its own ancient and weighty precedent, but that had not been used in quite this way, by quite this person, in quite this manner, for a very long time. The court felt it, like you feel a change in the weather before the clouds arrive, a pressure shift, a quality of attention that had altered without anyone being able to point to the exact moment when it changed. Something in the air of the palace at Thebes was different from what it had been. Something was coming. And in the quiet of her private chambers, in the hours before the dawn prayers when the palace was almost as still as it would ever be, Hatshepsut, great royal wife, regent, daughter of the god, keeper of a mind that had been preparing for this moment since before she had words for what she was preparing for, was making her decision. Not with drama, not with the theatrical urgency that stories tend to impose on their turning points, but with the calm, considered, unshakable certainty of someone who has thought a thing through so completely that the thinking is finished, and what remains is simply the doing. She had been patient long enough. The stars outside her window were the same stars that watched over Egypt for 3,000 years before her and will watch over it 3,000 years after. They did not hurry. They did not hesitate. They moved in their great fixed arcs with the absolute assurance of things that know exactly where they are going. She understood them perfectly.
There is a word in the ancient Egyptian language, necher, that means God or divine or something that participates in the sacred order of existence in a way that ordinary things do not. It was not a word used carelessly.
The Egyptians were precise people, in their theology as in their architecture, and they understood that the boundary between the human and the divine was not a wall, but a threshold, permeable, crossable, but only under specific conditions and only by specific figures. The Pharaoh was one of those figures. The Pharaoh did not merely rule in the name of the gods. The Pharaoh was, in the living moment of their reign, an expression of divinity itself. Horus embodied, the sun god's representative on earth, the human being in whom the cosmic and the mortal were most perfectly joined. To become Pharaoh was therefore not merely a political act, it was a theological transformation. And Hatshepsut understood this better than almost anyone alive. The transition from regent to pharaoh did not happen in a single morning. It was not a coup in the sudden and violent sense that word implies. It was something more Egyptian than that, more careful, more ceremonial, more deeply embedded in the logic of the system it was transforming. It happened through ritual, through the slow accumulation of symbolic acts, through the patient construction of a theological case so thorough and so carefully assembled that by the time it was complete, the conclusion felt not like a usurpation, but like an inevitability. She began with the images. In the temples and administrative buildings where official representations of the royal figures appeared, the artists who worked under her direction began making small, deliberate changes to the way she was depicted. The female form that had appeared in the earlier Regency images began, gradually, to be supplemented by something different. A figure in the traditional male royal posture, the striding stance, the squared shoulders, the formal rigidity of the pharaonic body, began appearing alongside and eventually replacing the more conventionally feminine representations. The face was still hers. The bone structure, the particular set of the eyes, the quality of expression that her sculptures captured with remarkable consistency across dozens of statues. These remained unmistakably, unambiguously female. The transformation was not a disguise, it was a statement. It was Hatshepsut in the formal language of kingship, wearing the visual grammar of the pharaoh the way a person puts on the uniform of an office. Not to pretend to be someone else, but to occupy the role completely, to signal to every Egyptian who looked at that image exactly what they were looking at. The false beard appeared. This detail has fascinated and sometimes amused people in the centuries since its rediscovery. The image of a woman with a clearly female face wearing the stylized, slightly upward curving ceremonial beard that Egyptian kings had worn since the earliest dynasties. It can seem to modernize like an awkward compromise, a half measure, a symbol of the tension between who Hatshepsut was and the role she was claiming. But that reading misunderstands both the beard and Hatshepsut. The ceremonial beard was not a statement about masculinity, it was a statement about divinity. It was one of the specific visual markers of the pharaonic office, as theological as the double crown, as meaningful as the crook and the flail. When Hatshepsut wore it, she was not pretending to be a man. She was claiming the full theological weight of the office she held. She was saying in the visual language that every Egyptian was fluent in that she was not merely a woman who happened to be running the country. She was Pharaoh, completely, legitimately, cosmically Pharaoh. And the beard was part of what Pharaoh looked like. It was audacious. It was also, in its own way, deeply traditional. Because Hatshepsut was not inventing the idea of a female pharaoh from nothing. There had been others before her, rare and each in their own way exceptional, but present enough in the historical memory of the culture that the concept itself was not literally unimaginable. Sobeknefru had ruled at the end of the 12th dynasty, taking the full male titulary of kingship and governing Egypt with apparent effectiveness for nearly 4 years. Further back still, in the mists of the earliest dynastic period, there were female names in the king lists that suggested a tradition, however thin and intermittent, of women who had stood at the apex of the state. Hatshepsut knew this history. She had been educated in it, and she drew on it not as a precedent that made her case for her. 1 or 2 female rulers across thousands of years was hardly an established norm, but as evidence that the theological framework of Egyptian kingship was, at least in principle, capable of accommodating what she was about to do. The theological case she built around herself was extraordinary in its ambition and its craft. The divine birth story was the centerpiece.
commissioned for the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, the great building that was already being planned and begun during this period of transformation. It depicted in careful, sequential images the story of Hatshepsut's conception and birth. The god Amun, king of the gods, greatest of the Theban divine family, had visited her mother Amos in the night. He had come in the form of Thutmose I, but he was divine, and the child conceived in that encounter was therefore not merely royal, but literally the daughter of the god himself. The story was not unique to Hatshepsut. Divine birth narratives like this had been used by earlier pharaohs to establish their theological legitimacy. But in Hatshepsut's hands, the story took on a particular urgency and a particular precision, because she needed it to do more work than it had done for her predecessors. She needed it to answer preemptively and definitively the question that was always hovering at the edge of her claim to the throne. The question of whether a woman could truly be the Horus king, the divine ruler, the theological necessity at the center of the Egyptian cosmos. Her answer was layered and elegant. Yes, she was a woman, and yes, she was also literally the daughter of Amun, chosen before her birth, consecrated to this role by divine will rather than human custom. The conventions of human succession, the expectation that the pharaoh would be a male, were the customs of men. But the will of the gods operated above human custom. And if Amun himself had chosen this child, who in the human world had the standing to refuse her? It was, as arguments go, difficult to counter. She reinforced it with her coronation narrative, another text commissioned for the temple walls, describing in ceremonial language the moment that Thutmose I had recognized his daughter as his rightful heir and presented her to the court and to the gods as the future ruler of Egypt. Whether the scene it described happened as depicted was less important than the theological statement it made. This woman had been chosen by her father, who had been chosen by the gods, who were themselves directing the whole unfolding story towards this outcome. The priests of Amun at Karnak were central to all of this. The relationship between the pharaoh and the great temple complex at Karnak was one of the most important structural relationships in Egyptian governance, and Hatshepsut cultivated it with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. She built for Amun. She built magnificently, expansively, with a lavishness that the temple complex had not seen in some time. She donated from the royal treasury with a regularity and a generosity that the priest of the accounts record with the satisfied precision of people whose institutional interests are being well serviced. She participated in the great festivals of the Karnak calendar with a visible devotion and a theological literacy that the priests found difficult not to respect. In return, the temple supported her. The Oracle of Amun, one of the most dramatic and politically significant institutions in Egyptian religious life, in which the god's statue was carried in procession and could be asked questions whose answers were communicated through the movements of the carrying priests, pronounced in her favor. The god himself, through his earthly representatives, confirmed that Hatshepsut had argued in stone and image and ceremony. She was legitimate, she was chosen, she was pharaoh. And Egypt, that vast and ancient and deeply practical civilization, accepted it. Not without complexity, not without the quiet resistance of those who found the whole arrangement uncomfortable and said so in ways that have not survived as clearly as the monuments. Not without the political maneuvering and negotiation that any major shift in the structure of power requires, but accepted it in the deep and functional sense, the sense that meant the grain was still being collected, and the temples were still being tended, and the borders were still being held, and the Nile was still somehow breathing through the land. The system worked, Egypt endured, and at the center of it, wearing the double crown and the false beard and the calm, absolute certainty of someone who was finally arrived at the place they were always moving towards, stood Hatshepsut, Pharaoh, God's wife, daughter of Amun, ruler of the two lands. The desert stretched out in every direction, golden and enormous and indifferent to human ambition. But inside the great walls of the temple complexes, inside the administrative corridors where the scribes bent over their papyrus in the lamplight, inside the throne room where diplomats from distant kingdoms came to offer their tribute and their respect, inside all of that, something had changed that would not be easily unchanged. A woman had made herself Pharaoh of Egypt. And the world, having watched it happen with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty and the particular pragmatic acceptance of people who have just seen something work,
turned its face forward, and moved on. As worlds do. As worlds always do.
There is a moment in the life of every great river when it stops following the path that the landscape has laid out for it. The water has been moving in a particular direction, shaped by the contours of the land, by the gradient of the earth beneath it, by the accumulated force of everything that has flowed before it and worn the channel into its familiar shape. And then something shifts. A new gradient appears, a weakness in the bank gives way, and the river, with the absolute unsentimental logic of water, simply goes where the ground allows it to go. Not because it decided to, not because it was trying to, but because that is what rivers do when the conditions are right. Hatshepsut did not become Pharaoh because she was reckless. She became Pharaoh because the conditions were right, and because she had spent 20 years making them right, and because she understood, with the precision of a person who had studied the landscape of power from the inside, exactly where the bank was thin enough to give way. But let us sit for a moment in the years just before that giving way. Let us sit in the regency itself, not the triumphant later period, but the early years, the careful years, the years when she was still officially the woman beside the throne rather than the woman on it. Because those years contain something important. They contain the mechanism of the transformation, the inner workings of how a regent becomes a pharaoh without the whole thing collapsing into chaos. The court of a child king was a particular kind of environment. It was, on its surface, a court like any other, full of ceremony and hierarchy and the elaborate social choreography that had been developing for over 1,000 years by the time Hatshepsut moved through it. The rituals were the same, the titles were the same, the administrative structures were the same, but underneath that surface, the dynamics were different in a specific and important way. A child king could not generate authority from his own person. He could not intimidate or inspire or command the room to the sheer force of demonstrated competence. He was a symbol, a necessary and sacred symbol, the living Horus, the vessel of divine continuity, but a symbol whose power derived entirely from the system around him, rather than from anything he himself was yet capable of projecting. This meant that the authority in the room had to come from somewhere else. It came from Hatshepsut. And the thing about authority that comes from a person rather than from a title or a symbol is that it is much harder to transfer away. You can give a title to someone else, you can replace a symbol, but a room full of people who have been looking to one particular human being for direction, whose instincts have been calibrated to that person's judgment, whose trust has been built through years of demonstrated competence and reliability, that room does not easily redirect its attention simply because the official hierarchy suggests it should. Hatshepsut understood this, and she built it deliberately. The officials who mattered, the viziers, the treasurers, the high priests, the military commanders, the governors of the great nomes, were people she had been working with for years. Some of them she had inherited from her father's court, old hands who had served Thutmose I with absolute loyalty, and who had watched young Hatshepsut grow from a sharp-eyed child into a sharp-eyed woman of formidable capability. Others were people she had elevated herself, men like Senenmut, who had risen through the court on merit, and whose advancement was therefore tied to her patronage and her continued prominence. These men were not merely her subordinates, they were, in a real and functional sense, her network. And networks, built carefully over years of mutual benefit and demonstrated trustworthiness, are one of the most durable forms of power that exist in any political system, ancient or modern. She also had the temples. The religious establishment of Egypt was not a single monolithic institution. It was a complex ecosystem of temples, priesthoods, and theological traditions that competed with each other as much as they cooperated. But at the apex of that ecosystem sat the great temple complex of Karnak and the priesthood of Amun, and Hatshepsut's relationship with Amun's priests was the cornerstone of her theological legitimacy. She had been cultivating it throughout her queenship, through donations and ceremony and genuine religious devotion, and now, in the regency, she intensified that cultivation with strategic precision. The oracle of Amun was particularly important. In the great festival processions that moved through the streets of Thebes on the gods' high days, the sacred bark carrying Amun's shrine was borne on the shoulders of the priests, and as it moved, it would pause and sway and dip in response to questions posed by the crowd or by officiating priests. These movements were interpreted as divine communication, the god himself speaking through the medium of his earthly vessel.
The oracle was not, by any cynical reading, a neutral institution. The priests who carried the bark and interpreted its movements were human beings with their own interests and their own institutional loyalties, but the oracle's pronouncements carried theological weight that no purely political argument could match. And the oracle spoke for Hatshepsut. On the occasion that she would later commemorate in her great inscriptions, the divine bark paused before her. The god recognized her. The priests interpreted the movement as divine designation, Amun himself pointing to this woman in front of the assembled crowd and saying, "This one, this is my chosen, this is the one I have prepared." Whether you read this as genuine religious experience, as institutional coordination, or as something in between, as the complex, layered reality in which belief and politics are always entangled in human affairs, the effect was the same. The theological infrastructure of Egypt had spoken, and when the theological infrastructure of Egypt spoke, the political infrastructure listened. She moved through these years with a quality of attention that must have been exhausting to maintain. Every ceremony required her to be fully present, not just physically present in the way that figures of authority can be present while their minds are elsewhere, but actually engaged, actually performing the rituals with the precision and the intention that the gods and the priests and the watching court required. Every administrative decision required her to have absorbed enough detail to make it correctly, to ask the right questions of the right officials, to understand the downstream consequences of the choices being made. And every political interaction required her to be running, simultaneously, the calculation that every person in a contested position of power must run. Who is with me? Who is against me? Who is uncertain? What does each of those people need in order to move in the direction I need them to move? It was, by any measure, an enormous amount to carry. But Hatshepsut carried it with what the evidence consistently suggests was a striking quality of composure. There are no records of instability or erratic decision-making or the kind of political missteps that typically mark a leader who is in over their head or who is operating from fear. The reign, from its beginning as regency through its full flowering as sole pharaohate, is characterized by a consistency that speaks of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was doing it from a place of genuine internal steadiness. This was not the composure of someone who felt no pressure. It was the composure of someone who had made their decisions so completely that the pressure, while real, no longer had the power to destabilize. She had chosen, and in the choosing, she had found a kind of freedom. Outside, the Nile was beginning its annual inundation, that great seasonal miracle that the Egyptians understood not as a natural phenomenon, but as a divine gift. The god Hapi pouring out the life-giving waters that would recede to leave behind the rich black silt that made the fields fertile. The farmers were watching the Nilometers, those measuring posts set into the riverbanks to track the rising water, reading the flood the way a physician reads a pulse, checking for the right level, the level that meant abundance rather than scarcity or catastrophe. Egypt was a civilization built on the knife edge of a river's generosity, and the woman who now effectively governed that civilization stood at her palace window watching the water rise in the golden light of an afternoon that had looked exactly like this for 3,000 years before her, and would look exactly like this for 3,000 years after her, and felt perhaps the peculiar double sensation that accompanies the exercise of real power in a moment of natural grandeur. The smallness of any single human life against the backdrop of something so vast and so ancient, and the remarkable, improbable, undeniable fact that this particular human life was right now at the center of it all.
Power, once fully claimed, changes the quality of everything around it. The air in a room shifts when a person enters it who holds genuine authority, not the borrowed authority of a title or the temporary authority of circumstance, but the deep, settled authority of someone who has earned the right to be exactly where they are and knows it without needing to announce it. The conversations change. The silences change. The way people position their bodies and choose their words and decide how long to hold eye contact. All of it recalibrates instinctively and immediately around the gravitational field of that authority. Hatshepsut, in the years following her formal assumption of the pharaonic titles, generated that kind of gravitational field. And she used it to build.
This is the period of her reign that the archaeological record speaks about most eloquently. The years of the great construction projects, the years when her vision for Egypt found its fullest and most durable expression in stone. Because while the political maneuvering and the theological argumentation of her rise to power are fascinating as history, it is in the buildings that Hatshepsut becomes truly legible to us. It is in the architecture that we can read most directly the quality of her mind and the scope of her ambition, and the particular aesthetic sensibility that set her apart from almost every ruler who came before or after. She did not build the way her predecessors built. Earlier pharaohs had understood construction primarily as an act of accumulation. More temples, larger temples, temples added on to temples in a process of continuous accretion that could sometimes result in spaces of enormous scale, but not always of coherent vision. The temples at Karnak, magnificent as they are, bear the marks of this accumulation. Centuries of addition and modification, each new pharaoh leaving their lair like a geological stratum, the whole ensemble extraordinary, but also, in places, slightly overwhelming in its density. Hatshepsut thought differently. She thought about space. She thought about approach. She thought about the experience of moving through a sacred landscape rather than simply the experience of arriving at a sacred destination. Her buildings were designed to be encountered, to reveal themselves gradually, to use the natural topography of their settings to amplify their theological statements, to create a relationship between the human body moving through them and the divine presence they were designed to honor. Her mortuary temple at el-Bahri is the supreme expression of this thinking. The site itself was not an arbitrary choice. It was a location of existing sacred significance, a natural bay in the cliffs of the western bank of the Nile at Thebes, a place where the limestone escarpment rises dramatically behind the valley floor in a way that creates a kind of natural amphitheater. An earlier pharaoh, Mentuhotep II, had built his own mortuary complex there, and its presence on the site was something Hatshepsut chose not to erase, but to respond to, her temple rising beside it in a conversation across centuries that is still visible today. The design was her chief steward Senenmut's practical realization, almost certainly, of a vision that originated with Hatshepsut herself. 3 broad terraces rise from the valley floor toward the cliff face, connected by ramps that draw the visitor upward in a gradual processional ascent. At each level, colonnaded porticos open outward toward the Nile, framing the view of the valley below in a way that is simultaneously humble and magnificent, the building acknowledging the landscape rather than competing with it. The proportions are perfect, not in the cold, mechanical sense of mathematical precision, though the mathematics underlying them is precise. Perfect in the breathing sense, the sense that every element is exactly as large as it needs to be and no larger, that the spaces between the columns are exactly wide enough to let the light fall in the way it falls, that the whole ensemble has the quality of something that could not have been otherwise. Modern architects who visit Deir el-Bahri for the first time very often fall quiet. Inside the colonnades, the walls were covered with painted relief carvings that told the stories Hatshepsut most wanted told. The divine birth narrative occupied one section, Amun visiting Amos, the child Hatshepsut presented to the assembled gods, the divine recognition of her nature and her destiny. Her coronation narrative occupied another, and in a third section, one that has captured the imagination of historians and archaeologists ever since its rediscovery, was something different from anything that had appeared on Egyptian temple walls before. The story of the expedition to Punt. Punt was a place of almost mythological significance in the Egyptian imagination, a distant land called Ta-Netcher, the land of the god, source of the incense and the myrrh and the exotic woods and the living trees that the temples required for their most sacred rituals. Egyptians had been trading with Punt on and off since the earliest dynasties, but the routes were long and uncertain, and the expeditions rare enough that each one was an event of genuine significance. By the time of the 18th dynasty, it had been some time since an Egyptian fleet had made the journey, and the goods that Punt supplied had been arriving, if at all, through intermediaries rather than direct contact. Hatshepsut sent a fleet. 5 large ships crewed by sailors and soldiers and trading officials carrying the goods that Egypt would offer in exchange for what Punt had to give. The expedition traveled down the Red Sea, a journey of weeks through waters that were navigable but not comfortable, past coasts that were unfamiliar to most of the people making the passage. And it arrived in Punt, and it traded, and it loaded its ships with treasures that the temple carvings enumerate with the loving specificity of people who cannot quite believe what they have brought back. Myrrh trees, their roots wrapped in baskets, transported lives that they could be replanted in the gardens of Hatshepsut's temple. Ebony and pure ivory, gold and green gold and cinnamon wood, throw sticks and eye cosmetics and baboons and dogs and the skins of the southern panther. The chief of Punt and his wife, the latter depicted in the temple carvings with a body type that has generated centuries of medical and anthropological speculation, offering their submission and their friendship to the great Pharaoh of Egypt. The ships returned laden, and Hatshepsut had the entire story carved onto the walls of her temple with a detail and a pride that speaks of something more than political theater. There is genuine wonder in those carvings. The artists who made them were recording something that their society found extraordinary. The distant world made present, the mythological land made real, the reach of Egyptian power made tangible in the form of living trees and exotic animals, and the warm submission of foreign chiefs. She presented it all to Amun. This was the explicit framing. The expedition was not undertaken for Egypt's material enrichment, though it enriched Egypt materially, but as an act of devotion to the god, a gift to the divine father who had chosen her and whose temple she was building and whose worship she was sustaining with all the resources at her command. The framing was genuine, insofar as we can read genuine feeling in official inscriptions. Hatshepsut's devotion to Amun appears throughout her reign in ways that go beyond the purely strategic, in the language she used about him, in the quality of the offerings she made, in the sheer scale of what she built in his honor. She believed, or at least she inhabited belief with such completeness that the distinction between believing and performing belief ceased to have practical meaning. Meanwhile, the obelisks were rising. At Karnak, in the most sacred section of the great temple complex, Hatshepsut erected a pair of obelisks that were at the time of their creation the tallest in the world. The logistics of this undertaking alone were staggering. The quarrying of the massive granite shafts at Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south, the transport of stones that weighed hundreds of tons down the Nile on specially constructed barges, the engineering of their erection without the mechanical technology that modern construction takes for granted. She had them sheathed in electrum, that ancient alloy of gold and silver that caught light with particular intensity from their tips down to a point that would have been visible above the surrounding structures. When the morning sun struck them, they would have blazed across the Nile Valley like earthbound stars, visible from miles in every direction, announcing to anyone who looked that something extraordinary was happening in Thebes, that a ruler of unusual vision and unusual resources was at work. She inscribed them with texts that have survived, in part, to present day. In those inscriptions, she speaks in her own voice, directly, in the first person, with a clarity and a confidence that reaches across 3,500 years with startling immediacy. She speaks of her love for Amun. She speaks of the offering she has made. She anticipates, insofar as we can read genuine feeling in official inscriptions, that future people will wonder at what she has built and will try to understand what manner of person created it. She was right to anticipate it. We are still wondering. The Nile moved past the base of the cliffs at el-Bahri, indifferent and eternal, the way it always had. The farmers tended their fields in its black silt margins. The priests performed their morning rituals in the temples that lined both banks. The scribes bent over their accounts in the administrative offices. The soldiers drilled on the training grounds outside the city. And at the center of it all, directing and shaping and imagining and building, not frantic, not rushed, but with the steady, purposeful energy of someone who has more to do than any single life can quite contain, stood Hatshepsut, Pharaoh, builder, visionary, the greatest ruler Egypt may ever have known. And she was still only in the middle of her story.
There is something about the act of building that reveals a person more completely than almost anything else they can do. Not the finished building, though that reveals things too in its proportions and its choices and the particular quality of attention it embodies, but the act itself, the process of deciding what to make and where to make it and how to make it and what it should say to the people who encounter it. That process is an intimate one, more intimate perhaps than the builder always realizes. It requires you to commit. It requires you to say in the most durable language available to you, here is what I believe matters. Here is what I want the world to remember. Here is the shape of the thing I am trying to leave behind. Hatshepsut committed completely. The building program of her reign was not merely large, though it was large, encompassing projects at sites across Egypt, from the delta in the north to the deep reaches of Nubia in the south. It was coherent. It had an internal logic, a consistent theological and aesthetic vision that ran through it like a thread, connecting the great mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri to the additions at Karnak, to the smaller shrines and way stations and restoration projects that she undertook with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that a civilization is maintained as much through attention to its existing fabric as through the creation of new monuments. She restored things other pharaohs had let fall into disrepair. She completed projects that had been started and abandoned. She added to existing complexes with sensitivity to what was already there, not always, and not without also asserting her own presence with unmistakable confidence, but with enough awareness of context that the additions feel, in many cases, like conversations rather than interruptions. This is the quality that distinguishes a great builder from a merely prolific one, and that extended beyond the physical structures to the human relationships that made them possible. Senenmut remains one of the most compelling figures in the entire story of Hatshepsut's reign, and the time has come to sit with him properly, to try to understand who he was and what he meant, both to the practical realization of her vision and to the more personal dimensions of her life that the historical record only partially illuminates. He was born into a family of modest means in the provincial town of Arment, south of Thebes. His parents were not scribes or administrators or priests. They were ordinary people whose names, Ramos and Hatnefret, we know because Hatshepsut later honored them in ways that left documentary traces, one of the small, touching details that occasionally surfaces from the mass of official records to remind us that historical figures had parents who loved them and whom they loved in return. He entered the administrative system through the scribal route, the path that Egyptian society had always kept open to intelligent men of non-royal birth, the meritocratic channel through which the civilization renewed its leadership class with fresh capability drawn from beyond the palace walls. He was, by every indication the evidence provides, exceptionally capable, not merely intelligent in the narrow technical sense of someone who is good with numbers and documents, but broadly capable in the way that true greatness of mind manifests, able to move between architectural theory and administrative logistics and religious ceremony and personal diplomacy with the ease of someone for whom no domain of human endeavor is entirely foreign. He became tutor to Neferure. This was the position through which he first entered into close proximity with Hatshepsut, and the images that survive of him with her daughter have a warmth that is not entirely explicable by professional duty. In one famous statue, Senenmut holds the small figure of Neferure wrapped inside his cloak, her face emerging from the folds of cloth with an expression of absolute trust. It is one of the most humanly affecting images in all of Egyptian art, not because of its theological significance or its artistic complexity, but simply because it looks like a person who genuinely cares about a child, and a child who knows it. Whether that care extended to the child's mother in ways that went beyond the professional is the question that has followed Senenmut through every historical account written about him for the past 2 centuries. The ancient Egyptians themselves were not silent on the subject. The crude graffiti found near the site of his unfinished tomb, drawn by workers who clearly found the situation amusing or scandalous or both, depict scenes that leave little to the imagination about what the popular opinion of the time believed was happening between the great steward and the pharaoh.
Graffiti is not evidence, popular rumor is not fact, and the Egyptians, like people in every era, were perfectly capable of inventing salacious stories about powerful figures without those stories bearing any necessary relationship to reality. But the relationship between Hatshepsut and Senenmut was, by any reading, unusual. He accumulated titles at a rate that had no clear precedent, over 80 distinct titles at the height of his career, a number so extraordinary that it becomes almost comic, like a list that keeps going because the person compiling it cannot quite bring themselves to finding new ways to describe someone's indispensability. He was overseer of the granaries, overseer of the cattle, overseer of the garden of Amun, steward of the king's daughter, chief steward of the king, overseer of all the works of the king. That last title matters most. Overseer of all the works of the king meant, in practical terms, that Senenmut was responsible for the physical realization of Hatshepsut's building program. He was the person who translated vision into construction, who managed the quarrying and transport of stone, who coordinated the armies of workers and craftsmen and scribes that a major building project required, who made the 1,000 practical decisions that stood between an architectural idea and a standing building. Whether he was also the original architect, the person in whose mind the design of Deir el-Bahri first took shape, is a question that scholars continue to debate. The Egyptians did not always make clear distinctions between the roles we would now separate as designer, engineer, and project manager. He may have been all three. He may have been primarily the last of the three, executing a vision that originated with Hatshepsut herself. He may have been a genuine creative partner, the two of them developing the ideas together in conversations that left no documentary trace, but left in the finished building a coherence of vision that suggests minds working in deep alignment. We do not know. We hold the question open, and we let the building speak for itself. What we do know is that Senenmut also did something unusual with the building. Hidden away in the upper portions of the temple structure, in spaces not intended for public view, he had his own image carved, small, concealed behind the opening doors of shrine niches, invisible unless you knew to look. It was an extraordinary liberty. The temples of ancient Egypt were not places where private individuals left personal marks. They were divine spaces, belonging to the gods and to the pharaoh, and the presence of Senenmut's image in that context was either a remarkable expression of personal presumption or evidence of a permission granted from the highest possible level. Or both. Because it's worth noting that Hatshepsut either knew about these hidden images and permitted them, or she discovered them and chose not to have them removed. Either interpretation speaks to a relationship between these two people that operated according to rules different from the ones that governed everyone else. The hidden images stayed, the building rose, the terraces of Deir el-Bahri lifted themselves toward the cliff face in their 3 elegant stages, the colonnades filling with painted scenes, the gardens being planted with the myrrh trees brought back from Punt, the whole ensemble becoming year by year one of the most beautiful things that human hands had yet made on the surface of the earth. And Hatshepsut moved through it all with the unhurried, purposeful energy of someone who has found the work they were made for. She was in her prime now, probably in her 30s if the chronological reconstructions are approximately correct, old enough to have the depth of experience that genuine confidence requires, young enough to have the physical energy that the demands of her position consumed in enormous quantities. At the height of her powers, in both the personal and the political sense, governing an empire, building monuments, conducting diplomacy, performing the sacred rituals that held the cosmos together, and managing the complex web of relationships and interests that any functioning court requires. And doing it all, it seems, with a quality of intention and attention that left almost everyone who encountered it with a sense of something remarkable having passed through their vicinity. The stars above Thebes were the same stars they had always been. The river moved in its ancient bed. The desert held its vast, patient silence on both sides of the valley. And in the temples that were rising from the limestone and the granite and the sandstone of the Nile Valley, something was being made that would outlast every attempt to unmake it. 3,500 years later, we are still here talking about her. Perhaps she knew we would be. Perhaps in the quiet hours before the dawn prayers, when the palace was still and the stars were bright, and the whole immense project of her life stretched out in both directions from the present moment, she allowed herself the thought that this would last, that she would last, that the stone was more patient than the men who would eventually try to chip her name from it, and that the truth of what she had done was already too deep in the fabric of the world to be entirely removed. She was right. She was, as often she was, completely right.
There is a quality that the greatest human achievements share, regardless of the era that produced them, or the culture that shaped them, or the materials from which they were made. It is not size, though some of the greatest achievements are very large. It is not complexity, though some of them are extraordinarily intricate. It is not even beauty, though many of them stop the breath with their loveliness. It is something harder to name than any of those things, a quality of inevitability, perhaps, the feeling that this particular thing could not have been otherwise, that every choice made in its creation was the right choice, and that a different choice would have produced something lesser in a way that is immediately, viscerally perceptible, even if you cannot articulate exactly why. The greatest things feel necessary. And the work of Hatshepsut's reign, at its height, has that quality. Not just the buildings, though the buildings have it most obviously, most durably, in the way that physical structures can hold the quality of the thinking that produced them across centuries and millennia, in a way that written words sometimes cannot. But the whole project of her reign, understood as a single, unified act of governance and creation and devotion, has an internal coherence, a sense of all its parts moving in the same direction, toward the same vision, that is the hallmark of a truly exceptional mind operating at its full capacity. She was, in the years of her full Pharaohnate, that mind operating at full capacity. And the first thing to understand about what she did with that capacity is that she did not use it for war. This is worth pausing on, because it runs against the grain of how we tend to measure the greatness of ancient rulers. The pharaohs we most readily recognize, Thutmose III, Ramesses II, the great military figures of the New Kingdom, are remembered primarily for what they conquered, for the battles they won and the territories they added and the enemies they defeated. The vocabulary of ancient kingship was, to a significant degree, the vocabulary of military triumph, and the temple walls of Egypt are covered with images of pharaohs and their war chariots, smiting their enemies with the upraised arm that had been the visual grammar of royal power since the very beginnings of the dynastic period. Hatshepsut is not absent from this tradition. There is evidence of military activity during her reign, campaigns in Nubia, operations in the Levant, the maintenance of Egypt's borders with the kind of firm attention that a great power must sustain to remain a great power. She was not naive about the requirements of security, and she did not neglect them. But war was not her primary language. Her primary language was creation, and she spoke it with a fluency and an ambition that the archaeological record has been slowly revealing in increasing detail and with increasing wonder ever since the 19th century began the long process of decipherment and excavation that gave Hatshepsut back to history. The scale of her building program, when you try to hold it all in mind at once, is genuinely staggering. At Karnak, the great temple complex that was the religious heart of Thebes, and in many ways the theological center of all Egypt, her contributions were multiple and substantial. The Red Chapel, a bark shrine built of red quartzite and black granite, its surfaces covered with relief carvings of extraordinary delicacy, was one of the most beautiful structures ever added to that already extraordinary complex. It was designed to house the sacred bark of Amun during the great festival processions, and its proportions and its carvings reflect a level of aesthetic care that goes well beyond functional requirement into something that can only be called love. The obelisks at Karnak were her most visible legacy there, the two great shafts of Aswan granite, the tallest in the world at the time of their erection, sheathed in electrum and inscribed with texts that spoke directly of her relationship with Amun and her understanding of her own place in the divine order. One of them still stands today,
It rises from the ruins of the surrounding structures that have fallen over the centuries, still reaching toward the Egyptian sky with the same quiet insistence it has maintained for 3,500 years. When you stand beside it and look up, the scale of it does something to your sense of what human beings are capable of. She built at Luxor, the great temple to the south of Karnak that was connected to it by the processional avenue sphinxes. She built at Medinet Habu. She built at Elephantine, at the first cataract of the Nile, where the southern border of Egypt proper met the beginning of Nubia. She built at Buin, deep in Nubian territory, a temple that extended Egypt's sacred geography into the conquered south. She built way stations, small shrine structures positioned along the processional routes that the great festivals used, with the practical attentiveness of someone who understood that the logistics of divine ceremony were as important as its theology. And she restored. This aspect of her program is less glamorous than the new construction, and it tends to receive less attention in accounts of her reign, but it is in some ways the most revealing. The Hyksos period, those centuries of foreign rule in the north that Hatshepsut's ancestors had ended, had left damage not just to Egypt's political confidence, but to its physical sacred landscape. Temples had been neglected, shrines had fallen into disrepair. The fabric of the civilization's relationship with its gods, expressed and maintained through the physical structures of worship, had been torn in places and frayed in others. Hatshepsut repaired it. Systematically, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a civilization is not just its monuments of ambition, but its monuments of continuity, she moved through the damaged and neglected sacred sites of Egypt and restored them. She did not always advertise this work loudly. Restoration is inherently less dramatic than creation, and the political capital to be gained from fixing something old is less obvious than the capital to be gained from building something new. But she did it anyway, and the evidence of her restoration survives in inscription after inscription, the careful notation of what had been damaged and what she had repaired. This is the act of someone who loves the thing they are governing, not merely someone who wants to rule it or who wants the power and prestige that rulership confers, but someone who genuinely cares about the civilization itself, its history, its sacred fabric, the accumulated weight of everything that has been built and believed and practiced across the millennia that preceded her. Hatshepsut loved Egypt. This sounds like a simple thing to say, and perhaps it is, but it is not a universal quality among those who hold power, and its presence in Hatshepsut is one of the things that makes her reign feel different from a merely ambitious one. The buildings she put up were not primarily about her own glorification, or rather her glorification and Egypt's glorification were, in her understanding, the same thing, because she was Egypt in the theological sense, the living embodiment of its divine order, and what honored her honored the civilization she embodied. This understanding gave her work a quality of devotion that goes beyond the personal. It is there in the details, in the care taken with the relief carvings, the attention to naturalistic detail, the expression of genuine feeling in human and divine figures that Egypt art was moving toward during this period, and that Hatshepsut's court patronage actively encouraged, in the choice of materials, the preference for the finest available stone, the skilled available craftsman, the quality of finish that says this matters and must be made to last, in the inscriptions, the texts she chose to have written, the prayers and the dedications and the records of offerings, the theological statements about Ma'at and divine order, and the relationship between the human and the divine. All of it coheres. All of it points in the same direction, toward a vision of Egypt as it should be, ordered, beautiful, devoted, prosperous, in right relationship with its gods and with the world beyond its borders, and toward a vision of herself as the person through whom that rightness was being maintained and extended and made more fully real. She was not wrong about herself. The evidence of what she built is too comprehensive, too consistently excellent, too clearly the product of a single governing intelligence operating across multiple domains simultaneously to be explained as anything other than work of genuine greatness. Outside the building sites, outside the temple precincts and the administrative offices and the throne room, the Egypt of Hatshepsut's reign was a country at peace with itself. The borders were secure, the trade routes were open, the agricultural system was functioning,
The Nile was being honored and the gods were being served, and the people were going about the remarkable, ordinary business of their lives in a civilization that, under her management, was working. This is the unglamorous foundation of all great reigns. Not the monuments, not the military victories, not the theological statements carved into temple walls, but the basic, grinding, never-ending work of keeping a complex human society functioning, keeping the food supply stable, and the administrative machinery honest, and the justice system operating, and the diplomatic relationships managed, and the whole enormous, fragile, extraordinary project of civilization moving forward rather than backward. Hatshepsut did that work. Every day, for 20 years. And in the evenings, perhaps, when the administrative documents had been dealt with, and the ceremonies had been performed, and the audiences had been held, and the decisions had been made, she walked through the gardens of the palace, where the myrrh trees from Punt grew in their transplanted soil, their resinous fragrance mixing with the night air coming off the Nile. And she looked at what she had made, and the night settled softly around her, warm and ancient and full of stars.
There are seasons in every great life when everything seems to be moving in the right direction at once. The work is going well, the relationships are sustaining, the vision that has been driving the whole enterprise feels in those particular seasons not like a distant aspiration, but like a present reality, something you can reach out and touch, something you can see taking shape around you in the accumulated evidence of years of effort paying forward into the world in exactly the way you hoped it would. Hatshepsut had such a season. It lasted, by the best historical reconstructions available to us, for the better part of 2 decades, 20 years, give or take, in which Egypt was governed with a quality of intelligence and intention that the civilization had rarely experienced and would rarely experience again. 20 years in which the monuments rose and the trade flourished and the temples were tended and the Nile was honored and the gods, if the gods were paying attention, had reason to be satisfied with what their chosen daughter was doing with the gift they had given her. But seasons, even the best ones, do not last forever, and inside the golden years of Hatshepsut's reign there were currents moving that the surface prosperity did not entirely conceal. Currents of relationship and loyalty, and the slow, inevitable shifting of the human landscape that surrounds any long reign. The first of these was Neferure. Hatshepsut's daughter had grown from the small child of the early Regency years into a young woman of evident significance, educated, prominent in the court, given titles and ceremonial roles that positioned her as a figure of genuine importance rather than merely decorative royalty. The most significant of these roles was the title of God's Wife of Amun, a position of considerable religious and institutional power associated with the female consort of the divine king and carrying with it substantial economic and ceremonial authority within the Amun temple complex. It was a title that Hatshepsut herself had once held. The passing of it to Neferure was a deliberate act of dynastic planning, a way of ensuring that the female royal line remained embedded in the most important religious institution in the kingdom, and perhaps a way of positioning Neferure for the role of great royal wife to Thutmose III that Hatshepsut had been contemplating as part of her long-term architectural thinking about the dynasty. Whether that marriage ever occurred is uncertain. The evidence is fragmentary and the scholarly interpretations of it diverge. What is clearer is that Neferure disappears from the records sometime in the middle years of Hatshepsut's reign, her name ceasing to appear in the inscriptions and the administrative documents with a suddenness that almost certainly means she died, though the circumstances and the exact timing are lost. She was young, probably not yet 30, possibly much younger. The loss of a child is a particular kind of grief that does not resolve into the administrative language of ancient records. It leaves no official trace beyond the absence. But the warmth and consistency with which Hatshepsut had honored Neferure throughout her life, the images of the child, the careful education, the significant titles, the famous statue of Senenmut holding her wrapped in his cloak, makes the silence that follows her disappearance from the record feel, even across 3,500 years, like the silence of bereavement. We do not know how Hatshepsut bore it. We can only note that she continued, that the buildings continued to rise, and the administration continued to function, and the reign continued to unfold with its characteristic quality of purposeful attention. That whatever grief she carried it in the way that people who have chosen to be responsible for large things must carry their private griefs, held without being denied, mourned without being allowed to consume the capacity for action that the role demanded. She continued. Senenmut also disappears from the record around this time, or perhaps slightly later, the exact chronology uncertain in the way that so much of this period remains uncertain. His unfinished tomb, discovered in the 20th century, contains the graffiti that speaks to his reputation in the popular imagination of his time. His image, hidden in the shrine niches of Deir el-Bahri, was later attacked, the faces scratched out, the figures defaced by hands whose identity and motivation have been debated ever since. Whether Senenmut died, or fell from favor, or simply retired from public life as his patron's reign entered its later phase, we cannot say with confidence. The man who had been so comprehensively present throughout the great years of building and governance simply, at some point, ceases to leave traces in the record. Another silence, another absence that the historical record declines to explain. What we are left with in the later years of Hatshepsut's reign is a picture of a ruler who has outlasted or lost several of the people who had mattered most to her personally, and who continues to govern with the same steady purposefulness that had characterized her reign from its beginning. She was the Pharaoh of Egypt. She was still building. She was still governing. She was still, every morning, performing the rituals that held the cosmos together. She continued. Thutmose III was growing. This is the other current running through the later years of the reign, the steady, inevitable maturation of the young king who had been the nominal ruler since childhood, who had been educated and trained in the court of Hatshepsut, and who was moving, year by year, toward the age at which the question of his independence could no longer be deferred. He was training with the military. The records that survive from his later solo reign describe a man of extraordinary martial capability, a strategist of the First Order, a leader who combined physical courage with the kind of tactical intelligence that wins battles before they are fully joined. These qualities did not emerge from nowhere in the years after Hatshepsut's death. They were developed over a long period of dedicated practice, and the court that provided the environment for that development was Hatshepsut's court. She trained her successor, whether she thought of it in precisely those terms or not. The relationship between them, already noted for its historical complexity, for the way it resists the simple narrative of either warm collaboration or cold rivalry, continued to evolve as Thutmose III matured. He participated in ceremonies. He appeared in official contexts. He was, increasingly, not merely a symbol, but a presence, a man of evident capability whose coexistence with Hatshepsut on the throne of Egypt was becoming, year by year, a more complicated arrangement to sustain. How aware she was of this, and what she thought about it, the historical record does not say. What it does say, in the language of the monuments that continued to be built, and the administration that continued to function, and the reign that continued to hold its shape through the later years, is that Hatshepsut did not step back, did not diminish, did not quietly begin the process of transition that some rulers in her position might have initiated as they moved through middle age towards whatever came next. She governed, fully, completely, with the same quality of intention that had characterized everything she had done since the regency began. She added to the temples, she made offerings, she performed the rituals, she managed the administration, she held the court. She was the pharaoh. Until she was not. The date of her death is uncertain, another of the long list of uncertainties surrounding this extraordinary life. Sometime around 1458 BCE, the best estimates suggest, after a reign that had lasted somewhere between 20 and 22 years for her formal assumption of the pharaonic titles. She was probably in her early to mid-40s, not young by the standards of the ancient world, but not old either. not a life fully expended, not someone who had used up everything she had. The cause of her death is unknown. A mummy that may be hers, identified through a combination of DNA analysis, dental matching, and archaeological context in work published in the early 21st century, shows evidence of significant health problems. Bone cancer, possibly. Diabetes. The accumulated physical costs of a life lived at the highest possible intensity, the body paying the bill that the mind had been running up for decades. She died in her palace, presumably, in Thebes, in the city she had governed and built and loved for all of her adult life. The Nile was outside the window. The stars were above the desert. The myrrh trees in the garden released their fragrance into the warm Egyptian night, as they had done every night since the fleet came back from Punt, with their roots wrapped in baskets and their branches full of the smell of a distant sacred land. And then she was gone. And what came after, what was done to her memory, and what that doing failed to accomplish, is the final chapter of a story that the night is not yet ready to release.
Death in ancient Egypt was not an ending. It was a threshold, a crossing, the moment when the visible portion of a life stepped back from the world of the living and moved into the invisible portion, the eternal continuation that the Egyptians had been building theological frameworks to describe and ritual infrastructure to support since before the pyramids were raised. The dead did not disappear, they transformed. They passed through the weighing of the heart, that extraordinary ceremony in which the soul was placed on the scales against the feather of Ma'at, the feather of truth and cosmic order, and found either worthy of eternal life or dissolved back into the undifferentiated matter from which all things came. Hatshepsut had spent her life in right relationship with Ma'at. If the theology she had built her reign around was true, if Amun had indeed chosen her, if the divine order had indeed been expressed through her governance, if the offerings she had made and the temples she had built and the rituals she had performed were indeed the acts of a soul in genuine alignment with the cosmic truth at the center of existence, then the scales would have held steady, and the feather would have balanced, and the eternal life that the civilization had been promising its faithful for 3,000 years would have opened before her. We extend her that grace. She had earned it, by any measure available to us. But in the world of the living, in the Egypt she left behind, something else was beginning. It did not begin immediately. The historical evidence suggests that in the years directly following Hatshepsut's death, her monuments remained intact, her name remained in the inscriptions, her image remained on the temple walls. Thutmose III assumed sole rule of Egypt with the efficiency of a man who had been prepared for exactly this moment, and who wasted no time in demonstrating that the preparation had been thorough. He launched military campaigns of extraordinary effectiveness, beginning the series of 17 campaigns into the Levant that would eventually establish Egyptian dominance over a territory stretching from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, and earn him the retrospective title of Egypt's greatest warrior pharaoh. He was, by every indication of his solar reign, exactly the ruler that the training ground of Hatshepsut's court had produced him to be. And for perhaps 2 decades after her death, the monuments she had built stood as she had left them, her name in the cartouches, her image in the colonnades, her story in the temple walls at Deir el-Bahri with all its extraordinary detail intact. Then the erasure began. The timing of it, somewhere in the latter half of Thutmose III's sole reign, when he was an older man rather than a young one newly released from the co-regency, is one of the most discussed puzzles in all of Egyptology. If the erasure was motivated by personal animosity, by a long-nursed resentment of the woman who had held the throne beside him for 2 decades, why not begin immediately, in the flush of finally being free of her presence and her authority? The question has generated a range of answers, and the most careful scholars hold several of them simultaneously, rather than committing to any single explanation. One possibility is that the erasure was not primarily personal at all, that it was dynastic, motivated by the desire to smooth the succession narrative for his own son and eventual successor, Amenhotep II. If Hatshepsut's reign was acknowledged in the official record, then the line of succession from Thutmose II to Thutmose III was complicated, interrupted by a woman who had not merely served as regent, but taken the full pharaonic titles and ruled in her own right. For a dynasty that wanted its succession story to be clean and unambiguous, that complication was a problem. Removing Hatshepsut from the official record removed the complication.
Another possibility is that the erasure was practical rather than vindictive, that the statues and images and cartouches bearing her name and likeness were removed not to punish her memory, but to repurpose the materials, to make room for new dedications and new inscriptions in temples that were being continuously modified and expanded. A third possibility is that the erasure was ideological, that something about the precedent Hatshepsut represented felt dangerous to those who oversaw it, that a female pharaoh who had ruled as successfully and as completely as she had was a precedent that the men around the throne did not want future generations to be able to point to and repeat. All three of these explanations may be partially true. History, especially ancient history, rarely reduces to single motivations. The people who ordered and carried out the erasure of Hatshepsut's monuments were complex human beings operating inside a complex political and theological context, and the decision they made, however it was arrived at and for whatever combination of reasons, was a large one, requiring significant resources and sustained effort across multiple sites. They chiseled her name from the cartouches. They replaced it with the names of the male pharaohs who had preceded her, Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III himself, the acceptable masculine line that the official record was being revised to present as unbroken. They removed her image from the walls of temples, sometimes replacing her figure with a pillar or blank space, sometimes with a different figure altogether. They toppled some of her statues, breaking them into pieces that were buried in pits near the temple complex at el-Bahri. Not thrown away, the scholars note, but buried, which may speak to an ambivalence about the destruction that even those overseeing it could not entirely suppress. The obelisks at Karnak were not destroyed. This decision, if it was a decision rather than a practical impossibility, has generated particular attention. The obelisks were too large, too visible, too magnificently made to be quietly removed without enormous effort and conspicuous spectacle. And so whoever oversaw the modification of the Karnak complex chose a different approach. They built walls around the lower portions of the obelisks, concealing the inscriptions that bore Hatshepsut's name from view, while leaving the great electrum-tipped shafts themselves reaching towards the sky. It was, in its own way, an extraordinary gesture, as if the people who ordered it, somewhere beneath the official reasoning, understood that these particular things could not be destroyed, that pulling them down would have been a wrong of a different order than chiseling a name from a cartouche, that there was a threshold, even in the project of erasure, that could not be crossed without something being lost that could not be recovered. The obelisks stayed, wrapped in their concealing walls, their inscriptions hidden but present, reaching towards the Egyptian sky with the same absolute composed insistence they had maintained since the morning the electrum first caught the light and blazed across the Nile Valley like an announcement that something extraordinary had been made here. They were still there when the walls came down centuries later. They are still there now. The process of erasure was, in the end, not as thorough as those who undertook it perhaps hoped. The scale of Hatshepsut's dumping program worked against them. She had built too much, in too many places, with too much detail and too much integration into the fabric of the existing sacred landscape for any reasonable effort to remove all traces of her. Her name and image survived in corners and on ceilings and in the less accessible portions of temple walls that the workers either could not reach or didn't bother with. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri retained enough of its original decoration, even after the modifications, to tell a coherent story to anyone willing to look carefully. And the Egyptians of subsequent centuries, moving through the temples and the sacred sites that Hatshepsut had built or restored or added to, were surrounded by her work even when they could not read her name in it. She was present in the spaces she had made, in the proportions of the colonnades and the quality of the carving, and the particular way the light fell through the openings she had designed, in the myrrh trees that continued to grow in the gardens of her mortuary temple, their fragrance carrying the memory of the distant land their ancestors had come from, in the obelisks that continued to catch the morning light and throw it across the valley in that particular blazing way, regardless of whose name was officially attached to them. She was there, quietly, stubbornly, with the patient permanence of stone and light and the truth that refuses to be entirely buried. The night deepens around us now, warm and full of stars, the Nile moving in its ancient bed somewhere beyond the edge of vision. And in the temples along its banks, in the carved and painted spaces where Hatshepsut's presence persists across 35 centuries of time and effort and change, the story is still being told. Not loudly, not insistently, but with the quiet, unshakable confidence of something that has already outlasted every attempt to silence it, and knows, in the way the truth always seems to know, that it will outlast everything still to come.
There is a particular kind of survival that has nothing to do with the body. The body is fragile, always has been, always will be, regardless of the century or the civilization or the resources available to protect it. It is made of materials that the world is patient about reclaiming: bone and sinew and the warm electrical mystery of consciousness, all of it temporary, all of it subject to the slow, indifferent arithmetic of time. Even the mightiest among us, the ones who commanded armies and raised monuments and held the fate of civilizations in their hands, returned eventually to the dust that the desert makes of everything. But some things survive the body. Ideas survive. Works survive. The trace that a particular quality of mind leaves on the physical world, in stone, in the proportions of a building, in the specific angle at which light falls through a doorway that was designed to receive it in precisely that way, that trace can persist long after the mind that made it has moved on to whatever comes after. And sometimes, rarely, a name survives. Not intact, not unscathed, not carried forward in the clean, unbroken line of continuous remembrance that the person who bore it might have wished for, but present, somewhere in the fabric of the record, like a thread that was pulled at and damaged and in places cut through entirely, but that was never completely removed, never reduced to nothing, never fully erased from the cloth it was woven into. Hatshepsut's name survived. It survived in the places the erasure did not reach, the corners and the ceilings and the less accessible wall surfaces where the workers either ran out of time or simply did not bother, calculating correctly that no one would look that closely. It survived in the fragmentary records of the Punt expedition and the obelisk dedications and the administrative documents that the scribal archives preserved with the dogged thoroughness of a civilization that took record-keeping seriously. It survived in the sheer physical mass of what she had built, in the mortuary temple at el-Bahri that was too large and too magnificent to be attributed to nothing, too coherent in its vision to be the product of a committee, too clearly the expression of a single governing intelligence to be stripped of its author entirely. And it survived in the obelisks, those two great shafts of Aswan granite, the tallest in the world when they were raised, wrapped in their concealing walls for centuries, containing, behind the stone that hid them, the inscriptions that Hatshepsut had placed there with the explicit intention of outlasting everything, including, she had written, those who might come after and fail to understand what they were looking at. She had been thinking about posterity when she wrote those words, thinking about the future readers, the future visitors, the people who would come to this place in times she could not imagine and stand before what she had made and try to comprehend it. She had addressed them directly, with a frankness that cuts through the ceremonial language of Egyptian royal inscription like a human voice cutting through the sound of a crowd. She had known they would come. She had spoken to them across the centuries. And eventually, after a very long silence, they arrived. The story of Hatshepsut's rediscovery is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the intellectual history of the modern world, and it begins, as so many extraordinary chapters do, with a code. The ancient Egyptian writing system, that complex, beautiful, theologically loaded script of hieroglyphs that had been in continuous use for 3,000 years, fell out of living use sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, as Christianity spread through Egypt and the old religious traditions that the script was bound up with began to fade. By the medieval period, no living person could read hieroglyphs. The script had become what it would remain for over 1,000 years, a collection of mysterious, evocative, utterly opaque symbols decorating the walls of ancient buildings that the people living among them could not interpret. Egypt became a landscape of beautiful silence. The temples were still there. Deir el-Bahri was still there, its 3 terraces rising from the valley floor toward the limestone cliffs, its colonnade surfaces still covered with the painted reliefs that Hatshepsut's artists had made, protected by the dry Egyptian air from the deterioration that would have destroyed them in a wetter climate.
The obelisks at Karnak were still there, their concealing walls having collapsed over the centuries to reveal the inscriptions beneath. The fragments of the statues that had been buried in the pits near the temple were still there, waiting under the sand. All of it was present, and none of it was readable. Until 1822. In September of that year, in Paris, a young French scholar named Jean-François Champollion sat down and wrote a letter that changed the way the modern world understood the ancient one. He had cracked the code. Working from the Rosetta Stone, that extraordinary artifact discovered by Napoleon's troops in Egypt in 1799, bearing the same decree in 3 scripts, including Greek and hieroglyphs, and from years of painstaking comparative analysis, Champollion had worked out the principles by which the hieroglyphic script operated. The ancient Egyptian writing system could be read again. The silence of more than 1,000 years broke open. What poured through the breach was staggering in its richness. Suddenly, the walls of the temples were not decorative surfaces, but texts. Dense, complex, theologically sophisticated, historically detailed texts that described the lives and the reigns and the beliefs and the relationships of people who had lived 30, 40, 50 generations before anyone now alive. Suddenly, the cartouches, those oval frames that enclosed the names of royalty, could be read, and the names inside them could be identified, and the history of the most extraordinary civilization the ancient world had produced could begin to be reconstructed with a specificity and a detail that no one had thought possible. The scholars descended on Egypt.
They went to the temples, and they copied the inscriptions, and they photographed the reliefs, and they argued with each other about the meanings of particular signs and the identifications of particular figures. They dug into the sand, and they found the fragments of things that had been buried and broken, and they pieced them together with the patience of people who understood that they were assembling not just objects, but stories. And gradually, in the inscriptions and the images and the fragments and the recovered names, a figure began to emerge from the long Egyptian silence. A figure in the double crown and the false beard, with a face that was unmistakably female. A face that appeared again and again across multiple sites and multiple media, with a consistency that said this was a real person, a specific person, someone whose features have been captured by artists who had actually looked at her. A pharaoh whose name, when the damaged cartouches were finally read and the incomplete signs reconstructed, resolved itself into something that the scholars had not been expecting. A woman's name, Hatshepsut. The reaction in the scholarly community was not, initially, entirely comfortable. The 19th century, brilliant in its intellectual ambition, its archaeological energy, its extraordinary capacity for the kind of sustained, painstaking scholarly work that the decipherment of ancient scripts requires, was also a century with its own assumptions about women and power and the relationship between the two. The idea that one of the most prolific builders in Egyptian history, the figure behind some of the most magnificent monuments in the ancient world, was a woman, this idea arrived into a scholarly context that had not prepared itself for it. There was resistance. There was alternative theorizing. There were attempts to explain the female images and the female name through frameworks that did not require accepting what the evidence most directly suggested: that a woman had ruled Egypt as pharaoh, completely and effectively, for over 2 decades. But the evidence was too comprehensive to be argued away. The images were everywhere. The inscriptions were clear. The building program was documented across dozens of sites. The divine birth narrative, the coronation story, the Punt expedition, the obelisk dedications, all of it pointed in the same direction, with the accumulated weight of a historical record that had survived, imperfectly but substantially, 35 centuries of time and deliberate erasure. Hatshepsut had come back. Slowly, across the latter half of the 19th century and throughout the 20th, the picture of her life and her reign was assembled with increasing detail and increasing confidence. Excavations at Deir el-Bahri recovered thousands of fragments of statuary, the broken pieces of the sphinxes and the Osirid headgears and the standing statues that had been systematically destroyed after her death, buried in pits near the temple with a thoroughness that had seemed like permanent elimination, but that had instead preserved them, protected by the same dry Egyptian earth that had preserved so much else, waiting for the people who would eventually come to find them. The
The fragments were collected. They were taken to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where they were cleaned and examined and, over decades of patient work, partially reassembled. Great osirid heads rejoining broken bodies, faces recognizing their own features in the rubble of their former selves. Hatshepsut looked out from the reassembled statues with the same composed, slight expression that her sculptors had given her in life. A quality of interior calm, of attention held inward, that seems almost too consistent across too many works to be entirely artistic convention. Perhaps it was who she was. Perhaps that was what she actually looked like when she was thinking. The night is very quiet now. The story has traveled a long way to arrive at this moment. From the palace at Thebes, where a sharp-eyed child watched her father hold court, through the careful years of queenship and the extraordinary years of regency and the magnificent years of the full pharaohate, through the silence of the erasure and the longer silence of the lost centuries, to the morning in Paris in 1822 when the code broke open and the ancient world began to speak again. We are almost at the end, but not quite. Because the most extraordinary part of the story, the part that carries the deepest resonance, the part that the long journey of Hatshepsut's survival seems to have been moving toward, is still just ahead. And the night, patient as the desert, is holding it gently in reserve. There's a moment in every act of recovery when the thing being recovered becomes real. Not real in the abstract, intellectual sense of a documented historical fact, not the reality of a name confirmed in a cartouche or an image identified in a wall relief or a reign dated to a particular set of regnal years in a scholarly chronology. Real in the other sense, the human sense, the sense in which a person who has been reduced to fragments and silence and the scattered evidence of what they once were suddenly reassembles in the imagination of someone paying close attention into something that breathes. That moment happened for Hatshepsut. It happened gradually, the way most genuine recoveries happen, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in the slow accumulation of detail upon detail, each one small in itself, but each one adding to the growing weight of a presence that was becoming, year by year and decade by decade, harder to dismiss as nearly historical. The fragments of her statues were reassembled in the storage rooms and galleries of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, a building in a city on a continent that did not exist in any Egyptian geography, housing the broken pieces of a woman who had been dead for 3,500 years. And yet the face that looked out from the reassembled granite was not an abstraction. It was specific. It was hers. The slight curve of the lips that appears consistently across dozens of representations. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of one. Something that suggests the person who finds the world interesting rather than merely manageable. The quality of the eyes, even in stone, that slightly inward quality, the sense of attention directed at something interior as much as exterior. The particular set of the jaw that speaks, in the language of faces, of someone who has made up their mind and is comfortable with the making. These are not the features of an abstraction. They are the features of a person. And the people who spent their professional lives reassembling those features, the archaeologists and Egyptologists and museum conservators who handled the fragments and matched the edges and debated the attributions and gradually, painstakingly built the physical presence back up from the pieces it had been broken into, many of them describe something that goes beyond scholarly satisfaction in their accounts of that work, something closer to recognition, the feeling of meeting someone. The 20th century did more for Hatshepsut's recovery than any previous period had managed. The excavations at Deir el-Bahri continued and deepened. The textual scholarship became more sophisticated as the field of Egyptology matured, producing scholars who could read the inscriptions with the fluency and the contextual understanding that first-generation decipherment had not been able to bring to them. The comparative analysis of artistic styles and architectural techniques allowed the building program of her reign to be mapped with increasing precision, identifying her contributions at sites across Egypt and Nubia, tracking the development of her distinctive aesthetic from its earliest expressions in the Regency period through its full flowering in the great works of her pharaohate. And then, in 2007, Something happened that was extraordinary, even by the standards of a recovery that had been producing extraordinary moments for nearly 2 centuries. A mummy was identified. The identification was the work of Zahi Hawass, then Egypt's chief archaeologist, and his team, a piece of forensic detective work that combined DNA analysis, CT scanning, dental examination, and the careful cross-referencing of archaeological context that makes modern Egyptology so different from its 19th century predecessor. A mummy that had been lying in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo for decades, largely unexamined, labeled with a provisional identification that had never been definitively confirmed, was subjected to the full range of available scientific analysis. The tooth was the key. A loose tooth found in a wooden box bearing Hatshepsut's name that had been discovered in the Valley of the Kings matched with forensic precision to a gap in the jaw of the mummy in Cairo. The DNA evidence, while complicated by the degradation that 3,500 years of time imposes on organic material, was consistent with the identification. The CT scans revealed a woman in her 50s, perhaps slightly older than the chronological reconstructions of Hatshepsut's reign had suggested, but within the range of possibility. The mummy of Hatshepsut, lying in a Cairo museum for decades without anyone quite knowing who she was, had been found. The announcement moved through the world with a speed that would have been incomprehensible to the people who had tried to erase her name from the stone. Within hours, the story was everywhere, carried by the same global networks of communication that make the modern world so different from any world that came before it, transmitted to people on every continent in every language, received by millions of human beings who had never previously heard the name Hatshepsut, and who found themselves, in the space of a news cycle, genuinely moved by the story of a woman who had ruled the greatest civilization of the ancient world, and been systematically erased, and been found again, here, in this museum, in this room, with a tooth. There is something about that detail that refuses to be solemn. A tooth. 3,500 years of mystery, and in the end, it was a tooth in a box. She would have appreciated the indignity of it, perhaps. She had, after all, a quality of mind that the evidence consistently suggests was not without humor, or at least not without the kind of ironic self-awareness that tends to accompany genuine intelligence. She had worn a false beard and called herself the daughter of a god and commissioned a fleet to sail to a mythological land and come back with living trees. She was not a person without a sense of the absurd dimensions of human ambition. A tooth in a box. Yes, she would have understood. The identification, while still debated in some corners of the scholarly community, as all such identifications are, and should be, given the stakes involved in making definitive claims about fragmentary evidence, added something to the recovery of Hatshepsut that went beyond the academic. It made her physical. It gave her body back to the story in the way that the statues, for all their specificity, could not quite do. It said, "Here she is. Here is the actual woman. Here are the bones that carried the double crown and the false beard. Here is the jaw that spoke the prayers in the temples of Amun. Here is the person. Here she is."
She was small, the analysis suggested, shorter than the idealized figures on the temple walls, as all the pharaohs were shorter than their idealized figures, because the figures were theological statements rather than anatomical records. She had suffered from significant health problems in her later years: the bone cancer that the CT scan suggested, the dental disease, the systemic conditions that the body accumulates across decades of physical stress. She had not been well in those final years. The body had been paying its debts. And yet she had continued to govern, continued to build, continued to perform the rituals and manage the administration and hold the shape of the reign together, because the work still needed doing, and she was the person doing it, and the fact that her body was struggling to keep up with the demands she placed on it was, in her hierarchy of concerns, apparently not sufficient reason to stop. This tells us something about her. Something that the statues, with their composed expressions and their theological perfection, cannot quite convey. Something that the bare physical fact of a body continuing to do hard work while it was deteriorating speaks to with a directness that no inscription could match. She was determined, not in the brittle, effortful way of someone fighting against their nature, but in the deep, settled way of someone whose determination was simply part of what they were made of, as fundamental to their composition as the granite was fundamental to the obelisks, not added on but intrinsic, not chosen in each moment, but simply present, always, as a basic quality of the material. She had been that way from the beginning. From the sharp-eyed child in the palace of Thutmose I, watching and absorbing and storing away everything she saw, through the careful years of queenship and the patient years of regency and the extraordinary years of the Pharaonate, through the losses, Neferue, Senenmut, the unnamed others who disappear from the record without explanation, through the work of building and governing and maintaining and creating that filled every year of her reign with the purposeful forward motion of someone who always had more to do. She had been determined, she had been capable, she had been, by the evidence of what she left behind, genuinely great, and she had been, in the end, human, fallible and mortal and subject to the same slow dissolution that claims every body eventually, regardless of the crowns it has worn, or the gods it has been chosen by, or the stone it has moved. She had been a person, complex and specific and irreplaceable in the way that every person is irreplaceable, possessed of qualities that the world will not see again in quite that combination, in quite that intensity, arranged in quite that particular way. The Nile outside the window of whatever room she died in had moved in its ancient bed without pausing. The stars had continued their fixed, indifferent arcs. The desert had held its patient silence. And Hatshepsut, daughter of Thutmose I and Ahmose, great royal wife of Thutmose II, regent and then pharaoh of the two lands, daughter of Amun, builder of Deir el-Bahri and the Red Chapel and the obelisks at Karnak, sender of the fleet to Punt, restorer of the sacred fabric of a civilization, one of the most capable rulers the ancient world ever produced, she had crossed the threshold that every life moves toward. And on the other side of it, whatever was waiting had received her. The feather of Mot, if the scales were true, would have held steady. The night grows softer now. The story is almost done. But there is one more thing to say, the most important thing perhaps, the thing that the whole long journey of this telling has been quietly moving toward. And the darkness holds it gently like cupped hands around a candle flame, waiting for the right moment to open.
There is a reason we tell stories about the dead. Not the practical reason, not the historian's reason, the need to document and preserve and understand the past so that the present can know where it came from. That reason is real and it matters, but it is not the deepest reason. The deepest reason is something older than scholarship and older than history and older, perhaps, than the written word itself. It is the reason that human beings have been sitting in circles in the dark and telling each other about the people who came before them since the first fire was lit against the first night. We tell stories about the dead because we need to know that lives mean something, not in the abstract, philosophical sense of meaning, not the cold comfort of significance assigned by posterity or measured in column inches or calculated in the square footage of monuments built, but in the immediate, felt sense of meaning that comes from looking at a human life and seeing in it something that resonates with your own, some quality of struggle or determination or love or loss, or the particular bittersweet experience of being a person in a world that is larger and older and more indifferent than any single person can quite encompass, and finding a way to matter within it anyway. Hatshepsut's life has that kind of meaning. Not because she was a woman in a position of power, though that is part of it, part of why her story carries a particular charge in the contemporary world, why the announcement of her mummy's identification moved through global networks with the speed and the emotional weight that it did. Not because she was erased and recovered, though that narrative of suppression and survival has its own deep resonance. Not even because of the monuments, magnificent as they are, the buildings that have been standing in the Egyptian sun for 3,500 years, holding their shape against the slow erosion of time with a patient stubbornness of things that were made to last. Her life has meaning because of what it demonstrates about the relationship between vision and reality, about what becomes possible when a person with genuine capability and genuine determination encounters a world that has not made room for them, And instead of accepting the room that has been made, instead of inhabiting the diminished space that the structures of their time and place have designated as appropriate, they simply, quietly, with extraordinary patience and extraordinary skill, make more room. Not by destroying what is already there, not by dramatic revolution or violent overthrow or the kind of charismatic disruption that makes for exciting narrative, but that tends to leave the structures it challenges intact while it burns through the people who challenge them. But by working from the inside, by understanding the system so completely that you can reshape it from within, by becoming so indispensable to the functioning of the thing that the thing itself begins to change shape around you. This is what Hatshepsut did. She did not overthrow the theology of ancient Egypt. She worked within it, used it, extended it in directions that served her purposes while remaining recognizably continuous with what had come before. She did not demand that the world rewrite its understanding of what a pharaoh could be. She simply became a pharaoh, so completely, so undeniably, so durably, that the world's understanding had to expand to accommodate what she was. She changed the possible by doing the thing. And 3,500 years later, the doing of it is still here, in the stone of Deir el-Bahri, in the granite of the Karnak obelisks, in the painted walls of the temples she built, and the fragments of the statues she commissioned, and the records of the expedition she sent to Punt, and the accounts of the offering she made to the god who chose her. All of it still here, in the dry Egyptian air that preserves what the wet world would have dissolved, waiting for the people who would come to find it, waiting for us. We are the future readers she anticipated when she wrote her obelisk inscriptions. We are the people she addressed when she said, in the formal first person of the pharaonic voice, that those who came after would wonder at what she had made. She was right that we would wonder. She could not have known the specific form our wondering would take. The museums and the universities and the satellite imaging and the DNA analysis and the global networks of communication that carry her story around the world in the time it takes to draw a breath. But she knew the wondering would come. She counted on it. She built for it. She built for us.
There is something in that thought that is difficult to hold without feeling something. A woman in ancient Thebes in the 15th century before the Common Era, making decisions about what to carve into stone and how to orient her buildings toward the light, and what stories to tell on her temple walls, making those decisions with an awareness that the people who would eventually encounter them would be separated from her by a gulf of time so vast that no living imagination could truly span it, and choosing across that gulf to speak anyway, to reach forward into the unknown future with the only tools available, stone and image and the careful, deliberate, enduring language of art, and say, I was here. This is what I did. This is what I believed. This is what I built. Remember me. And we do. Across 35 centuries of time and deliberate erasure and the general indifference of a world that has always had more things demanding its attention than it has attention available, we do. The name that was chiseled from the cartouches, and the face that was removed from the temple walls, and the story that was officially revised into non-existence have all come back, with the inexorable patience of truth that cannot be permanently buried, and they have found their way into the minds and the hearts of people everywhere. School children learn her name. Scholars devote careers to reconstructing the details of her reign. Visitors to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo stand before the reassembled fragments of her statues and feel, in the specific quality of that composed and slightly inward gaze, the presence of someone who was genuinely there. Visitors to the Karnak temple complex stand beside the obelisk that still reaches toward the Egyptian sky and look up and feel in the scale of it, in the quality of the stone, and the ancient text inscribed on its surface, the ambition and the devotion of the person who raised it. She is present in all of those places and all of those moments and all of those quiet individual encounters between a living person and the durable traces of a life that ended 3,500 years ago. She is present, not as a ghost, not as a symbol,
not the flat, two-dimensional figure of a historical lesson or a feminist parable or any of the other frameworks that the modern world tends to reach for when it needs to make sense of someone from the distant past, but as a person, specific, complex, irreducible, the sharp-eyed child and the careful queen and the patient regent and the magnificent pharaoh and the grieving mother and the determined builder and the devoted servant of a moon, all at once, all together, the whole complicated human reality of a life that was lived with extraordinary fullness and extraordinary intention from its first breath to its last. That is who she was. And the night, which has been holding her story with the same patient care that the Egyptian desert held the fragments of her broken statues, releases her now into the soft dark where all good stories go when the telling is done. Not ended, but resting, suspended in the warm and wordless space between one breath and the next, where the past and the present exist for a moment in the same place. Close your eyes. The Nile is moving somewhere in the dark, wide and silver and ancient, carrying the water that has always carried the life of this impossible, enduring, extraordinary civilization forward through the centuries. The stars above the desert are the same stars that watched over Hatshepsut's temples when they were new and bright and full of the sound of prayer. The stone is still there. The obelisk is still there. The 3 terraces of Deir el-Bahri are still rising from the valley floor toward the limestone cliffs in the morning that is always, somewhere, just beginning. And she is still there too, in the buildings that refuse to disappear, in the name that refused to stay erased, in the story that traveled 35 centuries through silence and damage and deliberate forgetting to arrive, tonight, here, in this quiet hour, in this soft dark, in the breathing space between wakefulness and sleep, where the most important things have always been best understood. She was here. She built something that lasted. She spoke across time to people she would never meet, and the people heard her. That is what it means to matter. That is what it means to leave something behind that the world cannot quite bring itself to lose. That is what it means to have lived, not safely, not within the room that was made for you, but fully, dangerously, with the whole force of a remarkable mind and a determined spirit pressed against the limits of the possible until the limits moved. Hatshepsut moved the limits, and the world, which has always been larger than its limits, expanded to hold what she had made. Sleep now. The story is complete. Not because it is ended, but because the best stories never quite end. They continue in the minds of the people who heard them, taking on new shapes, finding new resonances, connecting in unexpected ways to the particular life of the particular person who is listening in the particular quiet moment when the words arrived. This story will continue in you. Carry it gently into the dark. The desert is patient, the stars are fixed, the Nile moves in its ancient bed, unhurried and certain of its direction, the way all great things are. Not because they cannot be diverted, but because they've been moving long enough to know that the path forward always opens, even when it cannot yet be seen. Even when it cannot yet be seen. Good night.